in a bipartisan way to reassert the role of Congress in reviewing arms sales and pass 22 separate resolutions of disapproval. Today, I ask that we come together again. In fact, not even President Trump's own veto messages mention the word emergency. It's clear this administration has other motives from the start. We continue to hear officials invent new reasons for pushing through these sales. We've heard these sales are necessary for, quote, sustaining the global supply chain, for preventing, quote, loss of sale to peer competitors, for maintaining U.S., quote, credibility as an arms supplier, and so on. So look, many of us expected the president to use his veto powers. That's his right. But the constitutional, strategic, and moral imperatives that led the United States Senate to reject the sale of these arms 6 weeks ago still stand today. So let me review three main reasons that I hope we can unite today to override the president's veto. First is how these weapons are being used. By now, we are well acquainted with what has been at best the incompetent and at worst criminal actions of Saudi Arabia's airstrikes in Yemen. All evidence suggests that the Saudis have intentionally targeted hospitals, bridges, power stations, apartment buildings, weddings, schools, and yes, even a school bus filled with children, leaving thousands of Yemeni civilians killed or maimed. Over the years, Congress has received many assurances about how U.S. arms sales, advice, and assistance would supposedly help the Saudi Air Force and Command Authority better identify military targets and thereby reduce the risk to civilians. Those assurances no longer stand. We cannot brand the sale of precision-guided munitions as humanitarian weapons if the Saudis are intentionally targeting civilians in the first place. That's why last year I placed an informal hold on the sale of 60,000 precision-guided munitions, or PGMs, to Saudi Arabia, requesting the administration explain how they would enhance efforts to reduce civilian casualties. They've failed to do so in a fulsome and convincing way. And believe me, I'd like to be convinced. And after the slaughter of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in October of last year, the Trump administration apparently flat out gave up trying to convince anyone that the Saudis have any regard whatsoever for human rights at home, in Yemen, or at their diplomatic consulates abroad. Last week, recognizing the abject failures of the Yemen campaign, the United Arab Emirates announced it was ceasing its support and largely withdrawing from Yemen. I commend that as the right decision. I do not doubt that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are concerned about Iranian threats. But the indisputable reality is that these precision-guided weapon kits were always headed for this disastrous air war in Yemen. So again, let's not delude ourselves. These sales will in no way support Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or the United States from an imminent Iranian threat, full stop. Second, if we fail to override the president's veto, we will allow this administration to transfer American jobs and sensitive military technology to the Saudis. That's right. With this sale, the Trump administration has authorized Raytheon to allow the Saudis to begin manufacturing part of the electronic guidance systems for these precision-guided munitions. In other words, the administration is not only selling the Saudis these weapons, but also portions of the blueprints for building these weapons. This work has always and always should be done by American workers right here in the United States. America's defense industry produces the most sophisticated systems in the world. And yet the Trump administration is opening the door for the Saudis to manufacture their own similar weapons in the future or transfer our American-made technical know-how to other countries. Disturbingly, we also know that if the Trump administration gets this way, this transfer will not be a one-time thing. State Department officials have actually admitted to the Foreign Relations Committee staff that this will be the first of many sales, authorizing the Saudis to manufacture even larger, more sensitive portions of these highly advanced weapons. My colleagues, that is simply madness. Not only is this sale a Saudi jobs program, it's also a giveaway of sensitive U.S. military technology. The president's own veto message claims that not giving away American jobs and sensitive military technology to Saudi Arabia would, quote, abandon them. I'm guessing by them, he means the royal family the president is intent on praising and courting. I ask my colleagues who oppose stopping this sale or who are thinking of allowing the president's veto to stand, do you want to be on record supporting a Saudi jobs program? Do you want to be on the record as aiding and abetting the transfer of sensitive U.S. military technology to Saudi Arabia, a source of extremism and bloodshed in the world? S.J. Res. 37 disapproves a sale of precision-guided munitions to the UAE at a time when the UAE is pulling its military forces out of Yemen. Yet the president's veto message says that stopping this sale would somehow prolong the suffering in Yemen, which goes against any logic which I'm familiar with when they're withdrawing. S.J. Res. 38 disapproves the sale of fuses for Saudi bombs. Yet the president argues that stopping this sale will again prolong the suffering of the innocent in Yemen, presumably by denying the Saudis the ability to target them indiscriminately. It doesn't make sense. Finally, I think that all of my colleagues can agree that the United States and Saudi Arabia need a course correction. The brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, an American resident and journalist in a Saudi consulate, may have been the final violent straw that broke the camel's back, but we must re-examine this relationship. Beyond the Khashoggi killing and the atrocities in Yemen, the Saudi-led blockade of Qatar and the ongoing rift within the GCC are not in the interests of the United States. The Saudis' kidnapping of the Lebanese prime minister is not in the interests of the United States. And finally, Saudi Arabia's detention and torture of human rights activists calling for the same exact rights the Crown Prince himself pretends to support, its suppression of dissent and speech. This behavior does not reflect American values or our long-term interests. My colleagues, America is better than this. This Senate and this Congress must continue to stand up for reason, for decency, and for the actual foreign policy and national security interests of the United States, not the personal interests of the Trump family and their misguided willingness to put profit over principle and profit over people. This administration's willingness to turn a blind eye to the wholesale slaughter of civilians and the murder of journalists and move forward with the sale of these weapons will have a lasting implication for America's moral leadership on the world stage. That's why 6 weeks ago, in a bipartisan fashion, the Senate came together to approve an unprecedented 22 separate bipartisan resolutions of disapproval. That's why 5 weeks ago, the Committee on Foreign Relations approved a bipartisan bill, the Saudi Arabia False Emergencies, or SAFE Act, to prevent similar abuses of the emergency authority in the future. That's why 3 weeks ago, the House passed several amendments to their National Defense Authorization Act to stop these same arms sales. 2 weeks ago, the House passed 3 of the Senate joint resolutions of disapproval and sent them to the President. The first time since 1988 that any such resolution has passed the Congress, and the first time that multiple resolutions of disapproval had done so. And finally, just last week, the Foreign Relations Committee approved on a bipartisan vote the Saudi Arabia Accountability and Yemen Act. Legislation I introduced with Senators Young, Murphy, Graham, Reed, Collins, and Shaheen that would impose real sanctions, including on arms sales on Saudi Arabia for its atrocities. Legislation that I hope Leader McConnell will swiftly bring to the floor. I hope this administration appreciates the gravity of these actions and those to come. Today we have an opportunity to again demonstrate to the President, the Secretary of State, and to the butchers in Saudi Arabia that the United States Senate will stand up for our values, will stand up for our long-term national security interests, and will put country over short-term business interests. I urge my colleagues to take this stand today. override these vetoes, stop the Saudi arms sales. There are a few days in this body when we can say that our votes will save lives. Today is such a day. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The question is, shall S.J. Res. 36 pass the objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding? The yeas and nays are required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carver. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Resch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Durbin, Heinrich, Leahy, Manchin, Menendez, Murray, Reed, Sinema, Stabenow, Warner, Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative: Blackburn, Bozeman, Burr, Cotton, Crapo, Tillis. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye.
It is Shark Week.
Mr. Langford, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Thune, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Ms. McSally, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. No. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. No. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema. Aye.
Does any senator wish to change their vote? Is any senator not voted? On this vote, the yeas are 45, the nays are 40. Two-thirds of the senators voting, a quorum being present, not having voted in the affirmative, the bill on reconsideration fails to pass over the veto of the President of the United States.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, following the cloture vote on the Liberty nomination, the Senate vote on the cloture motion on the Welty nomination. I further ask consent that if cloture is invoked, the Senate vote on confirmation of these nominations in the order listed at 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, July 3rd, and that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the remaining votes in the series be 10 minutes in length.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question is, shall S.J. Res. 37 pass the objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding? The yeas and nays are required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Cortez Masto, Hassan, Heinrich, Lee, Markey, Menendez, Murphy, Murray, Rosen, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, Tester, and Wyden. Mr. Merkley, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Braun, Cassidy, Kramer, Daines, Grassley, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, McConnell, McSally, Roberts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Toomey, and Wicker. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mr. Manchin, Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Romney, no. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Alexander, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye.
Does any senator wish to change their vote? Has any senator not voted? On this vote, the yeas are 45, the nays are 39, two-thirds of the senators voting, a quorum being present, not having voted in the affirmative. The bill on reconsideration fails to pass over the veto of the President of the United States. The question is, shall S.J. Res. 38 pass the objections of the President of the United States? To the contrary, notwithstanding. The yeas and nays are required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Collins, Duckworth, Heinrich, Jones, Kane, King, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Peters, Reed, Schatz, Sinema, Smith, and Wyden. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. I got it. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Daines, Enzi, Grassley, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, McConnell, McSally, Roberts, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, and Wicker. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Gardner, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye.
So this is the announcement. Have all senators voted? Does anyone wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 46, the nays are 41, 2/3 of the senators voting. Not having voted in the affirmative, the bill on reconsideration fails to pass over the veto of the President of the United States. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Michael T. Liberty of Arizona to be United States District Judge for the District of Arizona, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Michael T. Liberty of Arizona to be the United States District Judge for the District of Arizona shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Wait. Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Young. Thank you. Portman. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun.
See, you as a guy.
Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, we have one more. No. Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Thank you. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Yes, for me.
Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Hoeven, Johnson, Jones, Lankford, Lee, Manchin, McSally, Moran, Murkowski, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Shelby, Sinema, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Rounds? Aye. Mr. Peters? Senators, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Brown. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Cortez Masto, Feinstein, Hassan, Heinrich, Leahy, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye.
She's going to aye on the next.
Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Hawley? Aye. Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Kane? No. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. Durbin? No. Mr. McConnell? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change your vote? If not, the yeas are 51. The nays are 37. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Peter D. Welt of North Dakota to be United States District Judge for the District of North Dakota, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Peter D. Welt of North Dakota to be United States District Judge for the District of North Dakota shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun.
Aye.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts.
Are there such things?
Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, McSally, Moran, Murphy, Peters, Portman, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sinema, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Warner, Wicker, Young. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye.
Yes.
Mr. Blunt? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blumenthal, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Heinrich, Hirono, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Reed, Schatz, Schumer, Smith, Stabenow, Udall, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye.
Any senators wishing to change their vote or that have not voted? If not, the yeas are 66, the nays 21. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Peter D. Welt of North Dakota to be United States District Judge for the District of North Dakota.